Good morning again. I think this is on. There you are. What beautiful music this morning. Thank you so much. And thank you, Heather, for your wonderful prayer. Appreciated that. I thought today that I would share, this is my second visit to Nunawading Church. I came here last January as a visitor for the first time. I'd lived lots of years in Victoria and had never come here to church, could you believe it? And so I came here last January as a visitor. That was lovely. And this is the first time I've preached at Nunawading Church. And my typical way of operating is that if I go to a church first, for the first time, I usually share my personal testimony, largely because it's a way of getting to know one another. So I'm hoping by the end of today we'll all be friends. I promise to be yours, and you can decide whether you want to be mine. I've got a clicker here. That's good. Okay. So what happens next? There you go, from atheism to faith. My name is Peter Watts. I grew up in the UK. I grew up in Birmingham, England. Birmingham is the second largest city in England. And if you've never been there and maybe you have no particular plans to go there as a tourist, it's not really a tourist destination. Birmingham was, I guess, it's a post-industrial town. It was very big around the Industrial Revolution. Lots of things are made in Birmingham, lots of manufacturing, and a lot of that has sort of moved on now, and it's kind of a post-industrial town. But you may you may actually recognise a couple of the major manufacturers from Birmingham. Maybe you've heard of this place. I know you probably don't eat that stuff. But Cadbury's began in Birmingham, England. John Cadbury opened his shop in Bull Street in the middle of Birmingham, and then later he moved out to a place called Bourneville to open a factory there. And so that's the name of the suburb, and that's where Bourneville chocolate comes from. But half my family worked at Cadbury's. So my grandfather worked there, my uncle worked there, my cousin worked there, and my mum's twin sister worked there. So lots of people from my family worked at Cadbury's. Another major employer in Birmingham, England was Austin Rover. If you've ever seen a Mini, the proper ones, not these new ones, but the proper Minis from 1959, they were made in Birmingham, England. And again, my grandfather worked there, both my uncles worked there, my dad worked there, and I worked there for a bit. And so that was another major employer in Birmingham, England. But before that, I grew up there, was born there. I was actually born in my mother's house, so I can go back and visit Mum's house, and it's the house I actually was born in. I was born in my brother's bedroom, so I pop into my brother's bedroom occasionally and say, tidy up, this is a special room. Born and raised in the UK as a secular person, really. My dad was an agnostic. He sort of would say, the religion started all the wars and so forth. And my mum was kind of a once-a-month Anglican. My mum would go to the church maybe once a month to have coffee with the ladies there and so forth. But my brother and I were pretty much atheists once we got into our teenage years. This is a picture of me at 14. And you can tell my mum used to cut my hair, I think. But that's a picture of me at 14. I put that up there because I remember at 14 for the first time, so I was aware, I went to state school and I learned evolution. That's how I thought that we got here, and I was quite an ardent believer. I thought, well, that's science, that's the facts, right? So, religion was just this, wishful thinking. But I believed in the facts. And so I believed in evolution, was taught evolution, and even to the point when around this time at 14, we'd go up the park, we'd get back from school, go up the park and play football. And we had a friend who was 12. He was the only one I knew that went to church. His family went to church. They took him to the local Anglican church. And I used to give him a hard time. I said, how can you believe in that stuff? Don't you know about the dinosaurs, blah, blah, blah. And so how wrong can you be? But anyway, at 14, I remember thinking that I had 4 wonderful grandparents. Now, whilst I grew up in a secular home to a large extent, it was a loving home. I enjoyed home life. It was a good family, And I had 4 wonderful grandparents, and I think one of my grandparents had gotten sick. And I started to think about, well, my grandparents are getting older, they're going to get sicker, and they're eventually going to die. And then my parents are going to grow old, and they're going to get sick, and they're going to die. And then I'm going to grow old, and I'm going to get sick, and I'm going to die. What's the point? What's the point to life? And I remember thinking that thought as a 14-year-old. And I actually thought about the logic of suicide as a 14-year-old. Now, I wasn't depressed or wasn't contemplating suicide for myself, but I thought about the logic of suicide in as much as if life's not going good for you and there's nothing else, why prolong the agony? You know, I thought about the logic of suicide at that point. Also at 14, I had a couple of mates, and one of my mates introduced me to smoking. He was interesting because he was younger than me, but he was significantly taller and bigger than me, and I guess he looked older than he was, and back then they didn't check your age that much. And so he could get cigarettes and alcohol, and he introduced me to cigarettes and alcohol and started smoking and drinking at 14. And sort of drifting along, busy going nowhere. This was me at 19. And back then, the trend was to get your hair dyed various colours. And so I had blonde hair, and so I dyed my hair jet black. And my friends were getting piercings, so I had my ear pierced and all sorts of other things. And so I was just a follower of my friends. I was a very shy teenager. And if my friends were doing something, then that's what I would do, because I just wanted to fit in with them. And I was really, I guess I was lost in every possible sense of the way, in the sense that I had no idea why I was here. I didn't know what I wanted to be. I didn't know what I was supposed to be. I just didn't have a clue. I mean, when it came to, you know, what are you going to do when you leave school? I left school at 16. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I left school at 16. I didn't really enjoy school that much. I was okay at maths, but everything else was, I had no idea why they were teaching it or what earthly use it would be. Now, I know you're not supposed to say that because education's really important, right? But I guess it depends which school you go to and what teachers are like. But I left school at 16. I had no idea what I was going to do, so my dad sort of guided me into being a car mechanic, and I did that for about 3 years. And that's what I looked like when I was a car mechanic. And then I was doing that, and I suppose when I think about this idea of not knowing where I was going or what I wanted to be, I was interested to hear a couple of weeks ago, maybe you heard it too, there was a news piece on Zoomers. If you don't know who the Zoomers are people who today are aged between 12 and 27. And if you're in that age bracket, then this may not apply to you, but this applies generally to that group of people. They were talking about, in general, what Zoomers think of life. And they were talking about the fact that Zoomers aren't really thinking much about the future. They are not planning to get married. They don't plan to have kids. They don't really imagine that they're ever going to own a home because it's just out of their reach. And so they live for the now. They live for the experience of doing things now because that's maybe all they have. And one of the things that it mentioned about them that I found fascinating was Zoomers believe the world will end before their life ends, which I thought, wow, that's an interesting idea. But I guess in many ways I had some of those characteristics. I worked as a car mechanic for about 3 years. The firm I worked for was part of a chain and they all went down and I got made redundant. Then my dad got me a job working in the car factory, the one I talked about before. And I would work in the car factory 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, on a production line which sort of moves at about this pace, you know, and you sort of fix something up on that car and there's another guy next to you, he's doing the same thing, and then you run around and fix up on the next car. So, and we were building the Mini. I worked on the Mini. And there were, I think, 400 Minis coming out every day shift or something. But it was monotonous work. If you've ever worked in a factory, you know what I mean. And then my friends, I had 2 friends who were working in a new restaurant that had come to town. And that was the restaurant. It was TGI Fridays. Now, I know that Forest Hill used to have a TGI Fridays. I don't know if they've still got one. And there used to be one at Doncaster, and they're sort of all over the place now. But back in those days, this was the first one to open in the UK. And it was a 230-seat restaurant. They had a big 4-square bar in the centre. If you've ever seen the TV show Cheers, which you may not have, but if you've ever seen the TV show Cheers, it's like that, with a big 4-pillar bar in the middle of the restaurant. And I got a job there as a cocktail bartender. And I worked there for 4 years. And it was the kind of place where I was juggling bottles and throwing glasses and telling jokes and trying to con people out of money and doing all sorts of things. But when I started working there, within about a year of me working there, Hollywood produced a movie called Cocktail with Tom Cruise and the Australian actor Brian Brown. And the company I worked for trained them for that film. In fact, the first bar that Tom goes into in the film is a TGI Fridays restaurant. And so when that came out, we all the employees went to the premiere, and we were responsible for promoting the film in nightclubs and restaurants and other places. And especially when the video came out, that was true, and we would, just do juggling and stuff like that. Well, about this time, a fella came to work at the bar, and his name was Steve. And Steve was doing the same job as I was doing, working as a cocktail bartender. We both actually got invited to go on live TV, and we were going to do this sort of routine thing together, but he ended up on one show and I ended up on another. But we got chatting, we became friends. And what I didn't know is that Steve had been raised Seventh-day Adventist. I'd never even heard of a Seventh-day Adventist. When I first heard the term Seventh-day Adventist, I thought, that's a weird name, they must be weird people. But then, since then, I've discovered, well, maybe some of them. Look, I'm weird enough, okay? I'm weird enough. But he was raised Seventh-day Adventist, and his parents had stopped attending church when he was 13, and so he drifted out into the world, and he was living the same life as me, doing the same work as me. And I remember we were working, this picture is taken in the service bar, that is, it's in the kitchen. So in the kitchen, the waitresses would go there for their drinks to take to the tables, and we would make them, and they would put in little order slips and you'd spike them and then make the drink. And on the order slips, there was a register number at the bottom. And the register number on this particular one time, we were both in there, and the register number ended in 666. And Steve turned to me and he says, hey, you know that number's in the Bible, don't you? And I said, I have no idea, but leave me alone. What are you talking about? I didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't want to know what he was talking about. I thought, this is a strange conversation. And I had no interest in religion. I thought religion was just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo and, was not interested at all. Well, over time, Steve and I became friends. We used to socialise together. We would go out together. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and he picked up a girl over the bar. Her name was Lisa. And they started dating, and we started hanging out together. Eventually, that's right, while we were working as a cocktail bartending, we were given the opportunity to study a Master Bartender Certificate. Yes, there is such a thing. And you had to basically memorise 400 cocktails and do exams on them. And then you also had to do free pour tests, which were blind, so you had to pour exact amounts. And then you also did performance. So you'd have a bank of judges, and you would be performing and making whatever drink they told you to make in as entertaining a fashion as you possibly could, and they would grade you. And so I would work from, say, 5 in the evening till about house. The ingredient could break, he'd put the kettle on or something, and he would come back with this book, The Pictorial Aid for Bible Study. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these books. It's a little bit bigger than an A4 folder. And he would bring this back, and he'd be trying to show me some pictures in it and talking about various things. And I thought, I have no idea what you're talking about. There's like this four-headed leopard, and it was like a marvel. I had no idea what he was talking about. But I remember on the inside cover, it said, printed at the Science Publishing Company, Warburton, Victoria, Australia. And I thought to myself, why on earth has this guy got a folder from Australia? I mean, nothing in England is printed. It's either printed in England or in America or even in Europe or something, but nothing is printed in Australia that's in England. And he'd never left the country, right? And I'd certainly never been anywhere near Australia. And I thought, why has this guy got this folder from Australia? And I remembered the address. Well, time went by. We both ended up leaving the bar work, and I became a sales rep for a glass processing company, and Steve became a driving instructor of all things. But we were friends. We'd still catch up. And I remember going round his house one Sunday and was chatting with him, and as his custom was, he would try to show me something out of the Bible. And, I was not the least interested. But when you've got a friend, or maybe you've got a spouse, who has a hobby, but it's not your hobby. And they're, really into this, and you tolerate that, right? You persevere, because their hobby may not be your hobby, but it's their hobby, right? And I thought, that's his hobby. He was also into the Lord of the Rings, right? And I thought, Lord of the Rings, Bible, same thing, And so he would be talking about, the geology of the world, the landscape. It looks as though it's been covered in a flood, and the Bible talks about a global flood in the days of Noah. And he was talking about that, and I said, oh, yeah, okay. And then he said, and then God put a rainbow in the sky at the end of the flood as a promise that he would never again flood the world. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know the Bible said anything about rainbows. I didn't know the Bible said anything about anything. I mean, I literally didn't know the Bible said anything about anything. Well, the next morning, I was driving to work. It's Monday morning. I'm driving into the middle of Birmingham. It's raining, and that was not unusual. But across the middle of the road, there was the brightest, most beautiful rainbow that I had ever seen. That's a picture. That's not it. Okay, it didn't look like that. I'm driving through this concrete jungle. It's raining, and there's this bright and beautiful rainbow right over the middle of the road. And I burst into tears. And I pulled over on the side of the road, and I don't know actually how to put into words exactly what happened, but I knew something had happened at that moment. I saw the rainbow, I burst into tears, something happened in here, and all I know is at that moment I knew there was a God, and I knew the rainbow was for me. And that terrified me, because I realized that if there was a God and that he was trying to get my attention, that I was accountable to him, and I knew my life. And so I was terrified, but I was overcome at the same time. It was a very strange experience. And if you had been telling me that you had had that experience yesterday, I would say, yeah, all right, fair enough. You saw the rainbow, you put 2 and 2 together and made 10, whatever. I would not have necessarily believed your story, but I couldn't deny the experience that I had and what was happening on the inside. I remember I pulled over on the side of the road, I was crying. I remember picking up the phone and saying, Steve, did you see the rainbow? And from that moment onwards, whenever I was with Steve, we started to study the Bible, and he would want to show me something in the Bible, and I would be interested. I'm now interested. Tell me what's in there. And I remember 4 significant things that he talked about. The first thing we looked at was Daniel chapter 2. You remember this morning I talked about how sometimes in evangelism we start with prophecy. And that's because prophetic foreknowledge, the prophetic foreknowledge of God, is a compelling argument for the existence of God. And when he had gone through Daniel chapter 2, and we had watched a video by Kenneth Cox on Daniel chapter 2, when the penny dropped, I said, that's not possible. I said that, I was blown away by Daniel 2. I actually, bizarrely, I thought, well, the Bible must be true. And I accepted the authority of the Bible based on that one chapter in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 2. It's still one of my favourite chapters in the Bible, still one of my favourite books of the Bible. We have one son, his name is Daniel John Watts, and he's named after Daniel and the author of Revelation. So I was blown away by Daniel 2. I was saying, why don't people know this? Why isn't this well known? The second thing he talked to me about was the Sabbath. And he did, I don't know, about a half an hour to an hour Bible study on the Sabbath, and he got the calendar down off the wall. I said, no way. You can't be serious. Are you telling me the whole Christian world doesn't know about the Sabbath? That just made no sense to me. And I was blown away by the Sabbath. It was so simple. I mean, I was not the brightest button in town, but I could count to 7. And when I learned about the Sabbath, I thought, that's amazing. I couldn't believe the world didn't know it. And I said, why doesn't the world know this? The third thing he taught me was what happens when you die. And that made so much sense to me, because as an evolutionist, as someone who believed in evolution, you live, then you die, and that's it. You're not floating around somewhere. You're dead. And the idea that when you're dead, made sense to me. Now, of course, there is the hope of the resurrection at the end of the world when Jesus comes in glory. Right? There is a resurrection. But the state of the dead just made a lot of sense to me, because death was just a mystery to me before that. I mean, as an evolutionist, I thought, well, you're dead, but you still have this sort of, I wonder. And the fourth thing that he taught me was the truth about hell. You know, the understanding that we have of the subject of hell is so liberating. I mean, I can't tell you. Like I said, on the road, when I knew that there was a God, I was terrified, because I felt that I was a sinner. And I hadn't really come to grips with the idea that God was my saviour. And hell, living and growing up in the Western world, living and growing up in England, you might have been a secular person, but you're very aware of, or at least you know what you think Christians believe. They go to church on Sunday, they sing a lot, and they believe if God doesn't love you, you're going to burn you forever and ever in hell. And so, I guess, either you trot along in fear, or you say, forget that. And when I understood that the Bible teaches that our God is a consuming fire, in other words, in the presence of sin, sin cannot exist in the presence of God because he is holy. It's like we're doused with gasoline, and, you know, people say, why doesn't God just come down and give us a hug? We go, because our God is a consuming fire. And he has to do something about our condition in order for us to live with him. It's not that he wants to live separate from us. We chose to live separate from him. And when I understood the truth about hell, that made a lot more sense. The idea that God could be holy, and he could be loving, and he could be just, and he could allow people to make their choices. Anyway, I was thrilled to be there. I was saying, this is amazing. What else is in here? I'd never heard this stuff before. Well, over time, we would have little Bible studies at Steve's house. And we would have a home-based small group Bible study, would you believe? It wasn't called that. We just got together and studied the Bible. So there was Steve and his wife, Lisa, and Diane, who was a waitress from the restaurant, me, and another waitress sometimes came along as well, and we would just get together and we'd study the Bible. And then I think after a little while, Steve thought, I better get in some reinforcements, because we were starting to ask some questions. And he invited a pastor, whose name was Adrian Broom. And Pastor Adrian Broom would come along, and we'd have these Wednesday night Bible studies. And that probably only went on with the pastor. It probably only went on for 2 or 3 or 4 maybe Bible studies. And Steve talked to me afterwards and he says, you know what? He said, I know the truth. I'm going to go back to church. I said, okay, I'll come with you. And so his first day back at church was my first day at church. And this is one of those early days. This isn't the first day. I'm carrying there a Bible that Steve bought me as a Christmas present that year. So he gave me a copy of the Bible and I started to be able to read that myself. And we're standing there outside the Worcester Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a tiny little church in the shadow of the great cathedral in Worcester. Okay? And we would go there, and I would go to Sabbath school. You better tell me when to get off stage because this could take a while. But I would go to Sabbath school, and there would be people talking, and I'd be listening because I knew nothing. And I'm listening, and the guy who was taking Sabbath school, I kid you not, he had long, straggly grey hair and a long, straggly grey beard, and I thought, wow, he looks like Moses, you know? And he was teaching the Sabbath school lesson, and people would comment and make questions and whatever, and there was a guy at the back with a bag full of books, and every so often he used to say, well, Sister White says this, and Sister White says that. And I had no idea who that was. I thought Sister White was a member, but she would maybe be coming some weeks. I can't wait to meet Sister White. I had no idea who she was, but I have an appreciation for Sister White now. Then we had the sermon, so that was nice, and then we had church, and they had a lunch. I think you're having lunch today. And at lunch, the church was very small, and the hall where they had the church lunch was even smaller. And they had a table, and they had a plate of sliced tomato, they had a plate of sliced cucumber, and then they had a plate of sliced round grey things, which I've since learned are nuttolene. I thought they were coasters. I said, is that food? I'd never seen anything like it in my life. But anyway, I continued to go to church for two main reasons. Number one, the people were friendly. And number two, they taught the Bible. And, you know, the room was very plain, maybe 20 people. They sang a cappella because nobody could play a musical instrument. They were singing out of the old hymn book, not the current hymn book. So there was nothing aesthetically that drew me there, but the people were friendly and they taught the Bible, and that was what I was interested in, so I kept going. Now, I have to say, when I said I kept going, it wasn't every week, because every other week, my football team was playing at home. That was Aston Villa, and I was a season ticket holder. So I would go to the football, watch the football, and if they were playing away, then I'd go to the church. So I had another church already. But I kept going, and then eventually I had a friend who had come to Australia. He'd been in Australia for a year. He came back. He was another bartender friend. And he said, hey, Pete, you've got to go to Australia, man. It's great. You'll love it. I won't say what else he told me. And so myself and another bartender and his girlfriend, we saved for a year to go to Australia for a year. And I got to Australia, and I was in Perth for 3 months. I looked up the church there, met some lovely people at the Adventist Church in Mount Lawley in Perth. And then I flew over to Sydney because I was starting to run out of money. And I got to Sydney and I joined a backpacker house, and I was in Crow's Nest, and that's the Crow's Nest bottle shop because that's where I got a job. I got a job at the Crow's Nest bottle shop, and I was working in the bottle shop there. And then after a few weeks, I thought, I'll look up the church again. And I went to Chatswood Seventh-day Adventist Church in Sydney and met a few people there, met the pastor and his wife. They were real nice, and they would have church. They would Sabbath school and then church, and then they'd have an afternoon meeting, and they would sit around and talk. And one of these afternoon meetings, the pastor said, Peter, tell us how you came to walk into our church. And I told them the story up to now, and they said, that's a fascinating story. Have you ever thought about being baptised? Well, I thought maybe one day, would you like to be baptised? Okay, let's start. And so I start studying the Bible with the pastor. And I remember getting home. I remember one time I'd gone there, Sabbath school, church, lunch, afternoon meeting, and then the pastor had said, well, I'm going to go and visit some of the people that have written their name in the visitors book. Would anybody like to go with me? Nobody put their hand up except me. I said, I'll go. And I went with the pastor and visited some of the people from the visitors book, not being a member, but I went with him. And I got home and I remember Jim, who was living in my backpacker house at Crow's Nest, he was another POM, and he said, "Where have you been all day?" I said, "I've been to church." "You've been to church all day?" I said, "Well, yeah." He couldn't get the idea that you would want to be in church all day. But I was becoming aware that not only was I a great sinner, but that God was a great Saviour. And I was falling in love with God. Now, I was working at the bottle shop, and I remember going next door to the backpacker house. There were a couple of young ladies who lived there, and I used to chat to them over the fence. And one of them invited me to a party, and we went to the party there, and I got drunk, which was not unusual. And I was sitting outside at the table with a guy I've never met before. He's drunk, I'm drunk, and I'm telling him about the mark of the beast. I got up from that conversation, went into the house, into the bathroom, shut the door. I looked in the mirror, I thought, this is ridiculous. And I realised that either I was going to be a Christian or I was going to be a drinker, but I wasn't going to be both. And I gave up drinking whilst working at the Crow's Nest bottle shop. It was interesting because I know then I didn't want to sell any. And there was a woman who would come in, she was probably 50 years of old, but she looked about 80. But she was probably 50, and she would buy a cask of red wine every night, and I knew who was drinking it. And so I thought, I'm a drug dealer. I can't do this. This is like being a drug dealer. And eventually, I'm doing Bible studies with the pastor, and I'd been praying. I'm saying, "Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, find me some work in the church." And the reason I prayed that prayer was, number one, I wanted to get out of this job. And number two, I knew that if I was not 100% focused on this God thing, that I would be a drifter. And my thoughts were, I've been in Perth 3 months, I've been in Sydney 3 months, I'm just going to get baptised, jump on a bus and go up to Brisbane and complete the tour. But I thought, if I do that, I'm probably just going to get lost in the crowd. And I thought, Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, find me some work in the church. Well, the pastor was talking to me at one of the Bible studies. He said, I've been praying that God will find me a young volunteer to help me run some programs in the church. I said, well, I've been praying that God could find me some work in the church. And he said, well, maybe the Lord's putting us together. And I went back to my knees and said, Lord, is this really what you want me to do? And it was as if God said, well, you asked, here it is. Do you want it or not? And to cut a long story short, I got baptised, and a week later I began working for the Greater Sydney Conference. So I went from the Crow's Nest bottle shop to the Greater Sydney Conference, and the pastor said to me, now you're going to have to sit down with the president, and he's going to ask you what you do. Tell him you're a shop assistant. Which I did, and that seemed to work. So I'm working then as a volunteer for the church with Pastor George Metcalf, if you've ever heard of him. And about 6 weeks later, another bartender friend of mine who's an American, he was getting married in America, so I emptied my bank account of about $1,800 and flew from Sydney to Minnesota, stayed there a week, saw my friend get married, then come home. When I get home, when I say home, I'm talking Sydney. I'd been away from England for 9 months at this point. I was feeling kind of homesick. There wasn't nobody special in my life. And so I prayed and I said, Lord, it was a Tuesday. I said, Lord, I need for you to find me a wife. And again, I didn't pray that prayer because I was just so desperate. It was more, I have no idea how to find a Christian young lady. I have no idea how to do that. And all I know is 3 days later, I met my wife, Marie. By the way, when I started working for the pastor, he gave me a copy of the Pictorial Aid for Bible Study. I said, hey, here I am in Sydney, and now I've got a copy of this book. Isn't that amazing? Eventually, Marie and I would get married. I finished my year in Australia, went back home to England for a few months, but Marie and I had become very close, and we actually got engaged while I was in England and she was in Sydney. And then I came back and we got married. And shortly after getting married, there was an opportunity to work at the Warburton Healthcare Centre because they had a job for a restaurant supervisor. And because I had worked in restaurant work, I applied, got the job, we moved to Warburton, which incidentally was where Marie's parents were. So that was convenient. Worked there for a couple of years. Then Marie's expecting our one and only son, Daniel. And I thought, I wonder if I'd like to get another job. I'd like to get a job that doesn't involve evenings and weekend work. And I thought, I wonder if there's any jobs going at the Science Publishing Company. And so I went down to the Science, and they said, well, we've got a job for a mature bookbinding apprentice. You'll have to take a cut of wages, a third. And Marie was giving up work, and we were trying to buy a house, and it was like trying to change 3 wheels on a car while it's going along. But we made that decision because we thought it would be better for the family. And so I took on the job as a mature bookbinding apprentice at the Science Publishing Company. And the first day I was working there, we were printing the pictorial aid for Bible study. And I worked there for 7 years, and we probably made that maybe 3 times in that 7-year period. But on the day I arrived, that's what we were making, and a shiver ran down my spine because it felt like I'd come home, because I remembered the address. And I worked there for 7 years. I would walk into the warehouse at the back of the Signs where they've got all the stock. I thought, this is like Aladdin's cave. Like you've got all the materials that were there. It was just brilliant. And so I enjoyed working there for 7 years, and then God tapped me on the shoulder and said, I've got something else I would like you to do. Okay, so the moral of the story. What can I share with you out of this? For the deacons, you've got a handout. I'd like you to start handing that out, please, while I just cover these 3 points. Number 1, share your faith because it'll grow your faith. Sometimes we think we've got to share our faith so that other people can find out about Jesus, and that's true. But if you share your faith will grow. Steve is working in a cocktail bar. He's trying to share what he knows about God with me. He remembered what he learned at Sabbath school. He's trying to share what he knows with me. His faith grew. God rekindled a fire in his own heart. Steve married Lisa. She became an Adventist. He shared a tape of a Morris Venden sermon with his mother. His mum got rebaptised. His mum and dad go to church again now. Diane, the other waitress, she got baptised the same day as Lisa. I got baptised the same day as them, but on the other side of the world. Share your faith. It will grow your faith. Mark Finley used to say that he thought God got him into evangelism to save others. He now realises God got him into evangelism to save him. So share your faith, it'll grow your faith. Number 2, God can reach anyone, anywhere. I was as far from God as you could imagine. I wasn't even interested. I wasn't even looking for God. Thankfully, God was looking for me. Never stop praying for people. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Never stop praying for people. You never know what God can do. And number 3, God has a plan for you. I'm not sure what that is. God has his general will for all people, but God has a plan for you. And if you place your life in his hands, he will work out that plan in your life. Thank you, deacons. I've asked the deacons to hand out this prayer slip. I want to tell you a little bit about this. So we talked about earlier this outreach opportunity for us in September. And you might be thinking, well, okay, how do we get people here or wherever the venue is going to be? What can I do today? What can I start doing now that's going to have an impact in September? And what I would like to suggest for you to do is, if you look on the blue side, there's an opportunity there to write in the names of 5 people. This is what I would like you to do. Write down the names of 5 people whom you know, but you know are not walking with the Lord. And I want you to pray for them every day. If you look on the B side, the green side, there are some steps to personal evangelism. Some people think that evangelists are only interested in public evangelism. That's not true. We only get results of public evangelism if people are doing personal evangelism. So steps of personal evangelism. Pray to God for spiritual revival. That's you and me. List your contacts. That's what you're going to put on the blue side. Pray for your contacts daily. Do so at your daily devotionals. You might think, well, I don't even do daily devotionals. Well, here's a good reason to start. Spend some time every day with God and then pray for your 5. You might say, well, I've got more than 5. Great, no problem. But at least put 5 on there. Pray for your contacts. Build a friendly relationship with them. How do you know this person? How do I build on that? How do I increase the number of times I get to see this person? How do I increase the length of the conversations we have? Intentionally do something good for them. Depends who they are. If they're into motorcycles, maybe look for a motorcycle magazine and say, hey, I was in the newsagents, I saw this, I thought you might appreciate it. Do you think they'll appreciate it? Of course they will. Do something for them. Invite them to your home if you're able. Eat with them. And then invite them to a care group. That's a good reason for having a care group, isn't it? And then invite them to the public evangelism meetings. This is something everyone can do, whether you're listening to my voice online, whether you're here in person. If you're alive and you can hear, you can pray, right? Everybody can do this. So I just want to invite you to pray that God reaches out to these people. And you might be surprised what God calls you to do for these people also. May God bless you.